In today's session, we're going to be talking about the OIDC, OpenID Connect, right? And how that interacts with the OAuth flow, right? So OpenID Connect is introducing the authentication part of it, right? Whereas the OAuth, I was actually dealing with the authorization, right? So that's a key big difference there, right? So really an OIDC is just an extension of OAuth. And if we look at our setup here, we have our client on the left-hand side, we have our authorization server on the right-hand side, and we have our resource server on the right-hand side. And we also talked about how the flow was broken out into two sections, the setting up for access and getting the access, right? So really the key main element here is when the client is actually reaching out to the authorization server, right, is actually specifying a scope. And that scope is an open ID scope. And that's basically the application is basically saying to the authorization that he wants to use he wants to verify the user's identity, right? So that's exactly what's happening here, right? So that's the key main element here. Then the authorization server kind of gives us the authorization grant. And then what we do is we take the authorization grant and we go back to the authorization server. And in return, we swap it for an access token, right? As we learned from the previous module. But in this instance, because we actually specified a scope of OpenID, we're also going to get an ID token. Now, basically this ID token, right, is essentially a JSON web token, right? And inside the JSON web token, if you kind of like break it down here, we have a header, we have a payload, and then we have like a signature, right? And inside the ID token, the actual payload, there's a bunch of claims inside there, right? And really, it's kind of like it's kind of like user attributes inside that claims, right? And then what we basically do is when we access the resource server here at the bottom, we basically use the access token that we already have, okay, plus the ID token that actually has our user attributes, and we use that when we're accessing the resource server, right? So really, if you kind of like think about it here, what we just really inserted here is we expanded the scope that we discussed previously in the OAuth, right? And now we're using an ID token, and that's really the basics of actually using OpenID Connect, right? And if you look in terms of the actual stack here, right, OIDC sits on top of OAuth 2.0, right? It's providing that authentication. And that concludes today's session. Thank you.